Hello everyone. This is my first time in Sweden ever, so I'm pretty excited to be talking to all of you at this amazing conference. First of all, there are lots of concurrent tracks happening, so thank you in advance for coming to mine. I also know that this is the session right after lunch, so hopefully at least some of you will not go into a food coma and just kind of humor me for the rest of this session. My clicker's not working. Come on. Right, so a quick introduction. My name is Hui Jing, and I'm simple enough that these emojis paint a fairly comprehensive picture of who I am as a person. You can ask me about any of them later if you're interested. Also, I happen to be Chinese. So if you're unfamiliar with Chinese names, our family names come first, and that's followed by our first names, which is 2 words. I go by Jing if that makes it easier. I also have a day job with a little e-commerce company called Shopify because I like to be able to pay my bills. So anyway, the main topic of today, right? CSS. CSS is a really big topic. And I figured that putting CSS in my talk title would mean that less of you would show up, which is exactly the case. But that's not the point. The fact that you did show up, I'm glad that you self-selected. So today, CSS being such a big topic, I'm going to specifically talk about CSS that is relevant for internationalization. But before we get into that, let us discuss English is a shit language. Numeronyms. Okay, numeronyms. Numeronyms are number-based words, where a number is used to form an abbreviation. So, I18N stands for internationalization because there are 18 letters between I and N. And some of you might have also seen L10N, which is the abbreviation for localization. But what is the difference between the two, you might be wondering? There is no canonical set-in-stone definition of internationalization, but the W3C does offer this guidance. It is designing and developing in a way that enables easy localization for specific audiences. So localization covers a broad range of customizations, including but not limited to things like numerals, time and date formats, currencies, symbols, icons and colors, even textual and graphical references. So this implies that internationalization is a lot more than simply translating the content on a site to different languages. There are nuances in the presentation of that content which will affect the experience of a native speaker using your site. And this is where CSS comes in. To be honest, this entire talk originated from an article that I wrote a couple of years back. And the main reason I wrote that article was because somebody said to me that CSS has nothing to do with internationalization. And it was my passive-aggressive 2,000-word response to that comment. I'm not a very nice person, by the way. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So to me, it is a vocabulary that we can use as developers to communicate with the browser. And the first standard for CSS was published on December 17th, 1996, which makes CSS an almost 26-year-old Sagittarius. Fun fact, when CSS first came out, it was not even meant for doing layout. You can check the 96 version of the spec and let that sink in for a bit. What do you mean CSS was not meant for doing layout? But it's true, and more than 2 decades later, we went from what seemed like trying to communicate to a toddler to having a pretty comprehensive vocabulary for telling the browser how we want stuff on our web pages to look like. And Lara Schenk wrote a great piece about the nature of CSS, concluding that it is a domain-specific declarative programming language. And I really like that definition. But internationalization, right? I'm going to make an assumption that most people in this room speak multiple languages. And your browser would probably have a default language. So the question is, have you browsed a website using Chrome which was in a different language from your default. And then Chrome kind of had that interface where it asks you, hey, do you want the page translated? The question is like, how does Chrome know to ask you this? Or if I phrase it another way, how come sometimes Chrome doesn't ask you? So the key thing here is the lang attribute. And the lang attribute plays a very important role because it specifies the natural language of the content of a web page. And this information is used for lots of different things. And the browser makes use of that as well. And browsers are pretty smart, and they come with a lot of sensible defaults. And so I'm not going to go into the parts about accessibility and semantic HTML. That's another like 3 hours. Those are very amazing in their own right. But if the browser knows what language your content is in, it gives you a lot of useful stuff out of the box, where you don't have to do anything. Browsers take care of it. So we're going to cover some of the browser's language-specific behaviors, and I'll show you what I mean by default font selection, and generally just talk about CSS. But this is a really good list of stuff that the lang attribute can give you. So if you don't remember anything from the talk, just remember to set the lang attribute on your website. That is like the baseline. And why? The reason why you should always set the overall default language on the HTML element, the very, very top, it's because if you only set it on the body element, the stuff in the head, which also contains content, right? And it doesn't get it. And the language code information is inherited according to an order of precedence. So if there is a lang attribute on an element itself, the browser recognizes that first. If not, then it checks for the closest parent. If there's nothing there, then it'll check for a HTTP header called content language. If that's not set, the user agent, it will check for the user agent's default values and the user preferences which you set. So it's different levels of how the browser determines what language the content is in. So let's see how we make use of this lang attribute. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this lang pseudo class, but in my opinion, it's a pretty cool selector. So in this example, we have this mixed language sentence with the markup shown like so. So it's like a P element with some other sub-elements in their M's and spans. The bit in Chinese is marked up as a span tag with the lang set to ZH, which is the language code for Chinese right now. Chinese writing does not have italic styles. For that matter, neither does Japanese nor Korean. And to emphasize words, Chinese writing uses a type of punctuation called 着重号, or emphasis dots. And the cool thing about the web these days is that such features like the emphasis dot can be done with CSS, right? So the relevant CSS property is actually called text emphasis. So I'm going to turn off the italics first and turn on these emphasis dots. And well, text emphasis is very relevant for Chinese text, but I don't think it was designed to be just for Chinese text. So you can kind of do like funny things like, I don't know, double circle. It's a thing. I don't know what you'd use it for, but it works. Triangle is an option. I tried. I'm like, oh, okay, that's kind of cool. You can even put in a string, but only the first character will be rendered. Not sure what you would use it for, but yeah, it's there as a feature. Just going to put this back to dot. So the point for this is that you can see that the selector, the lang pseudoclass selector, will recognize the language of the content of an element even if the language is declared outside the element. So in this case, the attribute is on the span and not the M itself, but the browser still knows which element to apply my styles to. So that's what the lang pseudoclass is very good for. Hey. Okay, I guess that doesn't work. Never mind. So lang is like any other HTML attribute. So attribute selectors can also be used to identify content with a particular lang value set. But difference from the lang pseudoclass is that it has to be on the element that you want to target. So in a way, it's kind of more specific, and that's the key difference between the attribute selector, if you use attribute selector lang, versus if you use the lang pseudo class. And attribute selectors are actually pretty versatile because of the number of options it offers for matching. So you can match the attribute value exactly, or you can match just the front part of the selector, you can mark, or you can even match anything before a dash. And there are a lot more attribute selectors that I listed than what I listed here, but these are, I feel, what are most relevant to language tags. So MDN has a full list of like the different variations of attribute selectors you can use. And a couple of things to note when you're trying to select an element based on language is that if you choose to use the language pseudo, the lang pseudo class, partial tag matching is already taken care of, which means that, for example, Chinese is one of those languages that has extended language tags. For example, there's like ZHHK, ZHTW for like the regional languages, and so on. So if you wanted to match all the Chinese characters within a document that has mixed extended Chinese language tags, it just works out the box. So partial matching works out the box. As for the mechanics of matching, the attribute selector operates based on the attribute that is applied to an element. So the element must have that attribute. Whereas the lang pseudo class makes use of a document's semantics. That's why the lang pseudo class worked in the example earlier. Of course, you're also free to use just normal classes or IDs, but then you'd have to like give all your elements very specific language CSS classes. So it's up to you. Like there are no hard and fast rules on how you want to write CSS. Use important if you like it, but I personally go for the pseudo class route. And so now we get to the CSS of things. There are numerous CSS properties available to us to let us fine-tune the presentation of our content from the font level all the way up to the layout level. So there's going to be quite a bit of typography-related CSS coming up. An example for font-level CSS would be the property that deals with faux fonts. So I'm not sure how many of you are friends with type designers. I have a couple of type designer friends. And when you use a typeface that does not include styles for bolds and italics, the browser actually tries, good-naturedly tries to recreate these italics and bolds by modifying the glyphs of the regular font face. And if you have type designer friends, they're very offended by this. Their aesthetic sensibilities are severely offended, and they're like, this font is wrong. And I'm like, okay. But apparently, you can see that there are some issues if the browser tries to artificially make something more bold and something more italic, because these variants, these typefaces are specially designed. So if they're not, they're features that kind of just impact the overall look of your text. And in the case of Chinese, actually, the italics are not even necessary. So there is a CSS property called font synthesis that can let us, tell the browser to like, it's cool that you're well-meaning, but please leave my font face alone. It's font synthesis none. So you can use this particular property, set it to none to fix the issue. And so again, combined with the lang pseudo class, you can kind of like resolve this text problem and make your type designer friends a little bit more happy. And it always stops working. And the lang attribute also impacts default font selection. So if you don't actually explicitly set a typeface, right? So Chinese fonts in general are really huge in terms of size, because there are a lot of Chinese characters. Personally, if it wasn't like my mother tongue, I wouldn't advise anyone to learn it as a second language unless you're really serious about it, because a baseline Chinese font design, you probably could only go to market if you had 7,000 done up. So that's about 1 megabyte or so, even if you optimize it. So it's really, really huge. And usually for Chinese websites, we don't use web fonts for the body text. Sure, maybe you'll see some custom font for headings, but for performance reasons, you probably try to subset it to that, like those 20 characters, and we'll usually use system fonts for the body text. So for this particular presentation, I did not explicitly specify any Chinese fonts. I just let it be and let, like, if you viewed it on a Windows machine, it would use the Windows defaults. I'm using a Mac. So the browser will pick the appropriate font. So again, guessing most of you don't actually read Chinese, but there are two variants of the Chinese script, simplified and traditional. And there are glyphs that look exactly the same for both characters. There are also glyphs that use completely different characters for the same word. And then there are glyphs like these that essentially look the same, but there are stylistic differences. So this particular glyph here, I tried to make it larger, so maybe you can kind of spot the difference. When I set the language to traditional Chinese, which is ZHHANT, Hanti, the browser knows to pick the Mac OS's default traditional Chinese typeface instead of the simplified Chinese one. So it looks very similar, but there are some stylistic differences between the two. And the lang attribute actually helps the browser do this identification and selection. And this one is specifically very East Asian. It says so in the property itself. Like I mentioned, described earlier, the whole thing about glyph substitution and positioning. So if you did not specify a font face specifically and you're relying on the browser to pick the font, you can actually use CSS to adjust the characters. So the default is actually simplified. So I'm just going to turn it off. And let's just toggle back and forth for the benefit of those of you who don't speak Chinese. You'll notice that through CSS, the browser actually knows to swap the glyphs based on the value of this property. So that's font variant East Asian. And the user agent will also refer to the lang attribute when rendering text. But if a selected font lacks support for that particular language, we can actually ask the browser to use the typographic conventions of a related language that are present in the font. So for an example would be Macedonian. So I don't think there are that many fonts out there that are specifically like support Macedonian. But the characters for Macedonian do share the same typographic conventions as Serbian. So for example, let's say the font you have doesn't have Macedonian support, but it does have Serbian support. You don't want to mislead the browser by telling it it's the wrong language, but you do want your Macedonian content to use these Serbian glyphs. What can you do? You can use font language override. So if you set font language override to SRB, which is the language code for Serbian, the browser will know to render the text with Serbian typographic conventions, but still recognizes that, oh no, this content is still Macedonian. So I think this is a pretty useful feature as well. This one's more common. I think most of us would have kind of used text transform or encountered it before. And most of the time we use it for case adjustments or maybe capitalization. But again, the browser also knows to take into account a lot of language-specific case mapping rules. For example, the German Asset becomes a double S if you set it to uppercase. And for Greek, the vowels lose their accent. So these are typographic conventions that the browser knows to use based on CSS values. For Japanese, there's even support for something called full-size kana. So for a lot of East Asian languages, we have this thing called Ruby annotations, which are usually used in conjunction with the main text to kind of inform. Usually it's trying to inform how the glyph is meant to be read. And so these are known as Ruby annotations, so this is relevant for that particular feature. And line breaking. So I think most people don't really think a lot about line breaking, but it's actually a very complicated topic for browsers to take care of. So this is like a groundwork example. So just bear with me for a moment. Everything on the web is boxes, right? So in this example, there are 5 inline boxes. What do I mean 5? If an element is, so this is the markup, right? There's a P container. If an element is within the P container, that's one inline box. The M is another inline box, that's 2. Comma was it is the 3rd inline box. The other strong really there. 4th one, at all question mark. 5th. So there are 5 inline boxes on this line. So right now there's enough room for all 5 of them to be in the same line box. But if there isn't enough room, these inline boxes are allowed to be broken into two line boxes. So this break at 0, that's known as a line break. So under normal circumstances where content wrapping is enabled, the user agent will minimize the amount of overflow by wrapping at a soft wrap opportunity, if one exists. So these soft wrap opportunities vary from language to language. For most writing systems, soft wrap opportunities occur at word boundaries, like 0 boxes, this is space, break it there. So usually it's spaces or punctuation. That's for a lot of language. But then, there are also other languages that don't behave like that. For example, English, Swedish wraps at spaces, but for like Chinese, Japanese characters, the break is per character. So every character could possibly be a word, a line break most of the time. But sometimes, maybe not, because there are also rules where that certain characters are not allowed to break before certain punctuation marks. So there are kind of very specific language rules. There are also a number of Southeast Asian scripts, like Thai, that is written without spaces between the words. So then, when do you break the word? You can break them at syllable boundaries. And I can keep going on here, but the point I'm trying to make is that many different writing systems have different ways of breaking text. And so there is CSS for controlling line breaks, this 4 here. The issue is there is an interplay between these 4 properties, and it's just for developers that are doing maybe multi-language sites to have more precise control over line breaking. So there are some rules that take precedence over others if both are present. Some only take effect if white space allows wrapping, for example. So these options are there in CSS to allow us to better do a presentation of content that is not English, right? And in addition to line breaks, having the browser know exactly what language your content is in also affects Wordbricks. Now, if you don't use the lang property properly, you won't get out-of-the-box support like automatic hyphenation. So the reason why browsers know how to identify different languages is due to dictionaries. There's like dictionaries built into the browser's capabilities, let's put it that way. And when the lang attribute is set correctly, browsers know how to automatically hyphenate words correctly. If you don't have the lang attribute, the browser's not going to attempt to do it at all, because incorrect hyphenation actually makes the text difficult to read. So it would rather err on the side of caution and just not break anything. So the property we're looking for here is called hyphens. And by default, the value is manual, which means you have to manually do the hyphenation. But you can set it to auto. And if the lang attribute is set correctly, the browser knows how to hyphenate at the correct points. And I think this is the most amount of time I spent looking for all these really, really long words in obscure languages that I don't even speak. But it's just to prove the point that the browser actually does support a lot of different languages and has dictionaries for all these different languages just so that I can do hyphenation correctly. So browser support is reasonable, but if you try to do this in Chrome, the hyphenation is a little bit different. So my suggestion, if you do want to use this for your content, is to kind of just test it to make sure that it's what you expect. Okay, let's move one level up to layout now. Writing mode, right? The default value for writing mode for most content on the web is horizontal-TB, which means horizontal top to bottom. And this is perfectly logical because the web was born at CERN, where the official languages are English and French. Moreover, most web technologies were pioneered in English-speaking countries, I think. But there are languages that run counter to that direction. Traditional Mongolian script runs vertically from left to right. And East Asian languages like Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, when written vertically, run from right to left. And so the writing, there are properties, the writing mode property, that allow you to make the text run in that correct direction. So vertical LR for like the Mongolian script, and vertical RL for the CJK languages. There are also values like sideways LR and sideways RL that rotate the glyphs sideways in case that's something that you want. Because every Unicode character has a vertical orientation property that informs the rendering engine whether to flip the glyph on its side or not. And you'll see some examples of this in the demos later. Basically, we can change a character's orientation using this property called text orientation. And this usually comes to play if you have vertically typeset East Asian text interspersed with Latin-based words or characters. So for abbreviations, for example, you can also have the choice to kind of squeeze them in to the space of one square character. So text orientation upright can allow you to force a language which normally doesn't display upright to go up. So in this case, the NBA, which would under normal circumstances being an English letter, would be flipped to its side. You can flip it back up. And text combined upright like squishes NBA into one character width. The issue with this is that for 3 letters, I think it looks fine. Anything more than 3 letters looks really, really weird. So you should keep that in mind if you end up wanting to use this for graphic design reasons. I'm sure it's an option. So there are also languages, the right to left languages, right, like Hebrew and Arabic. The writing mode does not actually cover these. And the reason for this is that the guidance that CSS should not be used for bidirectional styling at all. There is an algorithm called the Unicode bidirectional algorithm, which handles the display ordering of bidirectional text. For those of you who are interested, the thing that you want to look for in Google is the Unicode standard ANEX number 9. It's a pretty fascinating read. But the reason is because styling applied by CSS has the possibility of being turned off, like not loaded, going unrecognized. So it's like, it's not a guarantee that CSS will be there all the time. So why is writing mode in CSS, but RTL languages not? The reason for this is that the vertical languages can be read in both directions. So in the event that somehow your CSS doesn't render, having the CJK languages render but horizontally doesn't affect someone's understanding of the text. But for the right to left languages, that's the only direction that the text can be read correctly. So it has to be a guaranteed 100% rendered correctly every time. So that's why the recommended approach is to use the dir, direction attribute, on the base direction of text for display. Now, in spite of the fact that vertical writing is only relevant to East Asian text, it does not mean that vertical text only involves content in those languages. Like I mentioned, graphic design, right? Vertical text has been used in graphic design for a very long time across many different cultures. And the fact that we can do this on the web without too much trouble, I think, is a big plus to the world of like designing for the web. And this is a recreation of what I think is a poster published back in 1927. And the one on the left is the poster, the one on the right is recreated with just HTML and CSS. So, I mean, it's not perfect, it's not great, but I think it's not bad either, right? So it's like, eh. But it's possible. Like, you can do this with CSS properties that are supported in the browser right now. Now, the thing is, when I was trying to do that, the bits with the vertical text got a bit confusing when I had to adjust the paddings and margins on them, because for the most part, when we write CSS, we usually use like top, left, right, bottom, these physical directions. And that mental model, at least for me personally, is kind of hard to wrap my head around when the text flips its direction. I'll show you what I mean. So if I change the writing mode to vertical LR, for example. So it's vertical LR on there, and I'm like, I would like there to be a bit more. I don't want it to like be right up to the edge of the container, right? So like, let's give it some space at the bottom of the text. So I'd be like, oh, okay, bottom of the text. I would intuitively do something like margin bottom, say 1M, right? Nothing happens. Do you know why? Because it's not margin bottom I'm looking for, it's margin left. And so if I wanted to do like the top, the top is actually the left of the text. But if you did want to introduce more space, you'd have to do margin top. And basically this is confusing. This is confusing to me. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who finds it confusing, because there is a CSS specification for the rendering is weird. But anyway, there is a CSS specification for logical properties which map to the flow of text instead of the physical directions. So the terminology references block and inline instead of left and right, up and down, where block flow is the direction where your boxes on the web stack, and inline is the direction of content, of the words in the text. So this table shows the mapping for that positioning. And the corresponding mappings for margins, paddings, and borders. So if you look at this particular example, if the scenario here is whereby, based on the direction of the text, I want the start of the text to be yellow, end of the text to be green, top of the text to be red, bottom of the text to be blue, I would have to write 6 variations for the 6 possible combinations of writing directions. But with the CSS logical properties, I only have to write 1 set, and it applies for all the logical directions. So I think this is a pretty useful spec for those of us who are doing multi-language sites, especially if you're doing multi-directional sites. So if maybe it's like English or Arabic and so on. And so in addition to margins, paddings, and borders, there are also mappings for size. So instead of width and height, the corresponding mapping in logical properties is block size and inline size. So I think support is getting better for this. For those of you who are interested, you can actually start using these today. We're nearing the end. Hang in there, everybody. Another thing that CSS can do on the internationalization front has to do with lists and counters. So numeral systems are writing systems for expressing numbers, right? So even though the most commonly used system of numerals is the Hindu Arabic numeral system, like 0, 1, 2, 3, which we see a lot every day, CSS allows us to display ordered lists, the OL element, with a lot of other numeral systems in the world. So this is the one we're used to. I personally like this one. Probably the only other Chinese speaker in the room will know how to read this, but there's literally something called CJK, earthly branch. There's also CJK, heavenly stem. We can explain this to you later. You can come and talk to us later, but like this is a Chinese thing. But there are a lot of predefined counter styles which can be used with this list style type property. So in the spec, it's 174 different numeral systems from Alpha to Udur, but there is varying degrees of browser support for the different numeral systems. So you can check the full list of options on NDN, but if you have to display OL in a different language, you can do that. CSS counters are actually very fascinating, in my opinion. There's a surprising amount of logic you can inject into CSS counters. For example, I don't know how many of you had to do Fistbus for some ridiculous reason, or like test or whatever. I say, if you ever get this question again in future, tell the guy who asked you to do it, like, hey, I can do it in CSS, because you can. This has nothing to do with internationalization per se. I just wanted to mention it because I thought it was cool. But a ultimately, I'm still trying to learn more about internationalization best practices and how CSS, especially the newer techniques, can help us build a better experience for users all around the world. So these are some resources for those of you who are also interested in learning more, and also feel free to reach out to me because I love to chat more about this topic, CSS, and just web development in general. So thank you all of you for coming to this session.